Hey, this is Patrick from LSAT Lab. Let's work on breaking down arguments in the logical reasoning section. Each question in logical reasoning gives us a paragraph that we call the stimulus and asks us a question, and we call that the question stem. And then, of course, 5 answer choices. Well, there's 25 questions, so there's 25 stimuli in a logical reasoning section, and about 3/4 of them will be arguments or reasoning. Those are synonyms. The other fourth will be facts, principles, or paradoxes. So 3/4 of the time, we are reading an argument. We want to get good at that. What is an argument? It just means one claim that's supported by at least another claim. Usually that claim is an opinion, like we should eat vegetarian because eating meat contributes to climate change. We call that supported claim the conclusion of the argument, and we call the supporting idea as a premise or evidence. So another example, Eddie's guilty of arson. Why should you believe that? Well, he was standing by that burning building with an empty gas can. Notice that here it feels more legal. It feels like the conclusion is like the verdict and the premise is the evidence. And the defense lawyer will be like, all right, I grant you, yes, he was standing by the burning building, but I will fight you that that means he's guilty of arson. The most important thing to do in reading an argument is to find the conclusion, and they usually give us keywords that actually say, hey, this is the conclusion. In particular, we should have these first 4 memorized. You can pause the video if you want and read through these 5 arguments, but the point of them is just in each one there is a conclusion keyword that is showing you, hey, this claim right after the conclusion keyword is the conclusion. Now there's different types. You can make a recommendation, that's called normative or prescriptive. Sometimes the conclusion is a causal claim or accusation. A lot of these are rebuttals. A lot of them are predictions, and then a lot of them are just sort of judgments or labels. So summarizing where we're at. We're looking at arguments, which by definition means a conclusion, some verdict or judgment that's supported by at least one premise or some body of evidence. Speaking of evidence, anytime we see for, after all, because, or since, aka fabs, we know that the claim right after that keyword is playing a supporting role. The other evidence words are words that indicate that 2 ideas are being joined together to play a supporting role. But fabs needs to be the headline here. If you want to pause the video and read through these arguments, go for it. In each case, there is a fabs word that tells you, okay, this claim is a premise. And when we see after all or for, that always means that the conclusion was the previous claim. We're supporting the previous claim. Because and since have some flexibility, they can start a sentence or end a sentence, but we always know the other half of that sentence is a conclusion. A lot of arguments only have one premise, but most of them have multiple pieces of evidence. Sometimes those premises just operate independently, like we should eat vegetarian because it's inhumane to kill the animals and because it's making climate change worse. Other arguments actually have an intermediate conclusion that supports the main conclusion but has its own support. So we could have the same conclusion, let's eat vegetarian. Why? Because eating meat is hurting climate change. Well, why? Cows that are raised for meat fart out tons of methane, which is the most potent greenhouse gas. Sometimes the test will actually be measuring us on differentiating between a regular premise and an intermediate conclusion. They both support the main conclusion, but the difference is whether they have support. Why should I believe eating meat contributes to climate change? Crickets. There's no support provided, so it's just a premise. Why should I believe eating meat contributes to climate change? Oh, because cows have methane in their farts. That tells me that here it is a subsidiary conclusion. Support was provided. We can also call it a supported premise or a conclusion, but not the main one. Even more nerdy, we can say that this kind of premise on the left directly supports the conclusion, whereas a premise for an intermediate conclusion would indirectly support the main conclusion. Finally, if they ever say that a premise is providing partial support, they just mean that there's more than one premise. Let's have another recap. Arguments and reasoning mean the same thing, a conclusion that's supported by evidence. Some arguments are going to have multiple premises that just independently provide direct support for that conclusion. We can call it partial support, direct support, those both apply. Other arguments will have subsidiary conclusions along the way. The intermediate conclusion directly supports the main one, the premise indirectly supports the main conclusion. We're trying to find that conclusion in the evidence, and so sometimes they'll trash up the paragraph by adding in other stuff like background and opposing ideas. If our argument was saying we should eat vegetarian because eating meat makes climate change worse, They might add in a background claim about how much we currently eat meat, or an opposing idea that makes it sound like eating meat is good and going vegetarian would be bad. Opposing ideas come in a few different flavors. There might be a claim that's literally the opposite of the author's conclusion. Like, many people think it's good to eat meat. There might be a reason for that position. We evolved to eat meat. And the author might even concede something to that side. Like, yeah, I mean, it is tricky to get certain amino acids from a vegetarian diet. But let me make my argument anyway. That little magic line, of course, is where we expect to see pivots. When we start with background and counterpoint, we expect to hear a but yet however that then moves us into the author's argument. And then at that point, we need to assess whether we're getting conclusion followed by premise or premise followed by conclusion. Okay, let's pause the video, try to dissect this argument and classify all its claims. Welcome back. So this looks like a background fact. It's just telling me how big tomatoes grow. There's no opinion there. Most people, we would say, is an attribution, and believe is an opinion. And frequently, somebody else's opinion will be an opposing conclusion. As soon as we see since, we realize, okay, this is a conclusion. So other people are saying tomatoes are vegetables. I'm going to anticipate my author will conclude tomatoes are not vegetables. I'm waiting for that pivot to confirm that suspicion. First, I get the opponent's premise. Why should we believe tomatoes are vegetables? Well, because you put them in salads and savory dishes. Okay, so there is a little mini argument that the opponent is making. And there's that magical pivot. Hello, author. How was heaven, Mary Poppins? That is sort of the restart button where you're like, okay, here comes the argument, but in what order? Are we going to start conclusion and then go evidence? Or are we going to hear a premise and then get a conclusion? So when we look here, after all is showing us that the last idea is support. That's part of fabs. So we know the previous idea was a conclusion. Well, the last sentence actually has 3 claims, but we can use keywords to understand their function. Although claim 1, claim 2, and claim 3. So although always means we're starting with a disclaimer, a concession, and then the main clause in blue is where the author's presenting her real main idea, her emphasis. So that first idea is just an opposing point. Yeah, I know, tomatoes do seem like vegetables. We would never put them in a fruit salad. But then our author is making a little mini argument here. Because they have seeds, you can conclude they are fruit. So we get an intermediate conclusion. Tomatoes aren't vegetables. Why? Because they're fruit. Why? Because they have seeds. Hoo-wee! This argument's dense. 7 claims, that's a lot. But when we know keywords, we can sort of navigate the function of these claims better. Most people believe is giving us an attribution that will normally mean an opposing position. The since is supporting that opposing position. The but tells us the author is now entering the scene. They are wrong is a rebuttal opinion, so that's probably her conclusion. After all shows us we're definitely supporting that rebuttal. Although says I'm starting with a concession. And then the so tells us that one of the 2 premises is actually an intermediate conclusion. Since our goal is just to find the author's argument, let's think about how these keywords let us trim away stuff. That opening sentence is somebody else's argument. I don't care about their argument. And then although is like a disclaimer, I don't care about that. Claim 5 leads into claim 6. So we know that 5 supports 6, but because that whole sentence is prefaced with after all, it means that sentence is supporting claim 3. So 5 leads to 6, which leads to 3. Here's how we would diagnose the structure without actually reading any of the ideas. We would know that claim 6 is an intermediate conclusion, claim 3 is the main one, claim 5 is the supporting premise. As you can see, keywords can be really valuable. So we've got a bunch for conclusion, but so, thus, therefore the most common. We've got the 4-part FABS acronym for premises for support. Pivots really come in 3 flavors, but yet and however. They tell us that the argument is starting, but they don't tell us whether it'll start with a conclusion or with a premise. Opinion indicators normally mean you're looking at a conclusion. Should, clearly, obviously. And opposing ideas usually are prefaced with attribution or concession language. I've said 100 things, so don't feel bad if your brain currently feels like turkey and mashed potatoes.
Remember, it takes time to learn any new skill.
You mean you were once like me?
crying in your bathtub with all your stuffed animals around you, overwhelmed?
The doctor is in. Nah, not much. Just dissecting someone. Well, sure I can come. I mean, if they won't honor your tea time unless you have a fourth, my hands are tied.
Hey, kid. You ready for the big leagues?
I was born ready.
We are also going to practice. Pause the video and dissect these arguments. For the first argument, we get the word so, which indicates conclusion, and we get an outrage, which indicates an opinion. So we can tell our author's conclusion is that final sentence. We also want to get in the habit of thinking about the type of conclusion. This one would be a judgment. We're saying that these workers are unqualified. And why? What's the support? It would be the middle sentence. Statistics and studies are always evidence. So we want to be clear about what they're arguing, and we want to be charitable about how they're arguing it. Like, how are they trying to persuade me that they're unqualified? The 40% and 60% are complementary values. If 40% are certified, then 60% are uncertified. So the argument's trying to say, since 60% of them are not certified, 60% of them are not qualified. The author's making this move in her mind that if you're uncertified, then you're unqualified. That's an assumption she's making. The first sentence, meanwhile, is just background. They've chosen a contractor. Let's break down the second argument. The first sentence starts with something that resembles an attribution, so we might get ready for a pivot around the corner. And then we say, okay, yeah, however. All right, so my author is entering. Is she going to start with a conclusion or start with evidence? Well, the claim is saying this move is rarely good. That's an opinion, and opinions are normally conclusions, so this is probably our conclusion. And now when we move to the next sentence and say, after all, let me support what I just said. Okay, then the previous claim had to be a conclusion. So I basically already know the second sentence is the main conclusion. And how? Well, the attribution was just the first hint. Usually that's setting up an opposing point. The however started making us think, okay, this does look like a rebuttal argument. Is the author going to say something negative? Yeah, rarely good was like a negative rebuttal opinion. So that feels like it's probably the conclusion. And if you're going to suddenly start supporting it, then I'm almost 100% sure that the main conclusion was that rebuttal. So we know the second sentence is the conclusion. Let's be clear about what it is actually saying. What claim are they arguing? It has a pronoun in it. This move is rarely good. What move? Well, this move refers to selling the movie rights to a popular game. So our author's trying to say that selling the movie rights to a popular game is rarely a good business move. Why should we believe that? Well, the author tells us a story. There was this company that sold the movie rights to its popular game, but then the film sucked, and then later versions of the game sold worse than the original. So if we're trying to be charitable and think, all right, how is the author trying to make her case? She's saying that this was a bad move for them, business-wise, because whatever money they made from the movie rights, they lost it in terms of what they could have made on future versions of the video game. For a lot of questions, we're going to want to be skeptical because they're testing our ability to think of objections or notice assumptions. So we pretend to be the other lawyer. What? Rarely good? Selling movie rights is often a good business move. How would we respond to that evidence? We might say that, like, this was a good business move. You know, they made more money from the movie rights than they lost on future games. Or we might just say, like, all right, fine, it didn't work out for Star Quanta, but it's worked out well for a lot of other businesses. The first objection is arguing this wasn't bad business. We're really disputing the logical force of the evidence. This was supposed to be an example of a bad business move. In the second one, we're actually acknowledging, fine, yeah, it was bad for them, but it's not usually bad. So we're kind of accepting the logical force of the evidence, but we're raising some additional consideration that goes against it. Here's another example. We should elect X, not Y, because Y has no political experience. The other lawyer would have to argue that we shouldn't elect X. You know, Y is at least as good. How would we respond to this evidence? We might just say, you don't need prior experience to be good in this role. We're disputing the logical force. Inexperience isn't a bad thing. Or we might be like, yeah, it is bad, but X is also inexperienced, and at least Y is like a successful CEO. So here we're sort of accepting that inexperience is bad, but offsetting it with other considerations. Let's look back at the structure of those two arguments. The first one presented a statistic and then concluded something using the word so on the basis of that statistic. The second one actually starts with an opinion after a pivot and then uses after all to say, here, let me support that opinion. Let me show you why you should believe that conclusion. Let's pause the video one more time and try dissecting these two arguments. In the first argument, we might be attracted to but, which looks like a pivot, so we think, all right, that first sentence probably didn't matter, just background, here comes the argument. And then we see the word so, which we think indicates a conclusion. But these words that commonly mean conclusion and these words that always mean premise can also be used in a different way. Here they're being used to make arguments. Since Pam's ahead, she'll win. Since meat has nutrients, it's good. But these words can also sometimes show up to indicate cause and effect. We could say, since Pam sprained her ankle, she can't play tonight. Or, meat is high in protein, thus it takes time to metabolize it. We need to be receptive to the idea that these words sometimes will just be indicating cause-effect relationships. And that's what's happening here. Retinas are too far forward, which causes a blurry image. This isn't reasoning, it's just causal information. The last sentence, though, is showing a conclusion. This example shows that. That's saying, this evidence I've produced shows you my verdict, that eyes are adapted to needs, not an abstract sense of well-designed eye. Check it out. The box jelly's eyes see prominent features, not fine detail. We hopefully hear that both of those claims are saying it's this, not that. They're basically parallel claims. Some arguments look like that, where you have to force yourself to see the connection. Brianna's good at limericks, thus some plumbers create fine art. You'd be like, okay, I guess Brianna's the plumber and the limericks are the fine art? Similarly, when we lay out this premise and conclusion in parallel, it's easier to see that the author's thinking that seeing prominent features is all the box jelly needs, whereas seeing fine detail is what you would abstractly think a well-designed eye could do. Feeding it to our brain in the same rhythm helps us see the connection, just like 60% aren't certified, so 60% aren't qualified. When it comes to this second argument, we start with what looks like a background fact and then a word so. So is this conclusion so or cause-effect so? Is it opinionated or factual? Well, it's a fact. These patients are taking another drug. So if it's not an opinion, it's not our conclusion. Meanwhile, we see since in that final sentence, and we know that since introduces a supporting claim, and that the other half of that sentence has to be a conclusion. Also, that final claim has should, an opinion indicator. Opinions are almost always conclusions. So this argument is trying to say, I recommend that patients take this new drug in addition to the one they're currently taking. All right, the new drug grows bone cells. The one they're currently taking preserves bone cells. And the reason we're doing this is because they take some other drug that increases their risk of bone loss disease. All right, so if we were going to be skeptical and argue, no, they shouldn't take the new one in addition to the existing one, how would we respond to the evidence or outweigh it? The idea of should is that the positives outweigh the negatives, and if we're trying to argue should not, we're saying the negatives outweigh the positives. We could try to downplay the positives and be like, they're not really at that high a risk of bone loss disease, so we don't really need to do anything. Or we could try to play up the negatives of taking this new drug. Maybe it's way more expensive, maybe it's got uncomfortable side effects, or maybe it actually has like complications if you combine it with the old drug. When we're being skeptical about an argument, we're basically thinking, how can I accept the evidence but argue that the conclusion isn't true? And when you be skeptical with the plan, you're like, how could I go along with the plan but not be better off or not achieve the goal? When the recommendation is just that we should do something, then we're really analyzing whether the upsides outweigh the downsides. When the conclusion is more conditional, like, well, if you want Y, you should do X, we really are just judging, does X actually help me to get Y? And when the conclusion is, if you want Y, you must do X, we also want to be thinking, well, wait, are there any other ways to do Y? Is X really the only way? All right, now we're going to challenge you with 4 arguments at once. Pause the video and dissect them all. Welcome back. All four of these arguments had a conclusion in the final sentence. The top two use wording like "this shows that," "this demonstrates that," and the bottom two just use simple old "thus." When we're reading the top two arguments, we want to notice that the evidence being introduced is like research, surveys, studies, statistics. Why? Well, LSAT authors almost always have a conclusion that offers some causal explanation or interpretation of that data. So when we read the conclusion, we want to be thinking, wait, does it have to be that, or could there be alternate explanations? Are these conclusions causal? Yeah, this first one's saying advertising has no causal impact on smoking. And the other one is basically saying that putting people in prison has no causal impact on reducing crime. So sometimes the authors will look at a set of data and say, oh, there's not a causal relationship. We call those anti-causal arguments. And let's practice being skeptical of anti-causal for a sec. Say that we say, before Jerry took his first test, he went through Linda's course, but since he only got a 140, Linda's course clearly didn't help him improve his score. We would want to argue, well, wait, it could have been worse. Maybe he would have only gotten a 130 without her course. Even though his score wasn't like good, it's possible the course made it better. Let's say someone's arguing that Tom and Jerry both studied, but only Jerry took a prep course. Tom just self-studied. Since they both ended up with a 150, I guess the course was a waste of money. There we would want to attack the comparison and say, well, it's not fair to compare. Jerry started off 20 points lower than a 150. Jerry studied for half the time. Jerry had to overcome a learning disability. The course did help him. Technically, the first argument isn't anti-causal. We're rebutting an anti-causal claim. The tobacco company was anti-causal. Advertising doesn't have any effect on people smoking. And our author's conclusion is saying, yes, it does. So she's actually making a causal conclusion. What's her evidence? Why should we believe it has some causal impact? Well, she tells us that, according to research, countries that put restrictions on tobacco ads have seen reductions in the number of people smoking. Now, that's a correlation. It's saying where one thing has happened, another thing has happened. But our author is treating it like causality. She thinks that the restrictions on ads caused the reduction in the number of people smoking. One of the biggest patterns we're going to need to be skeptical of is moving from correlation to causality. Correlation language is something we need to learn to spot. It sounds like two traits are associated, they show up disproportionately. People who have trait 1 are more likely to have trait 2. And it's just saying, all right, there's some association between banned smoking ads and lower rate of smoking. One causal possibility is that the left causes the right, and that's what the author is saying, that the ban on cigarette ads led to the lower rate of smoking. But another possibility could be the right caused the left. Maybe the lower rate of smoking came first, and once people quit smoking, it's like, hey, I don't want to see those advertisements tempting me. It's also possible that these are both just symptoms of some underlying third factor. Maybe there's some strict theocratic government that says it's morally wrong to smoke, and it's also illegal to advertise smoking. So when authors choose one explanation, they're failing to consider these alternate explanations. We want to memorize reverse causality and third factor as alternate ways to explain a correlation between two things. So here the author's evidence was a correlation. In countries where smoking ads are banned, they've seen reductions in rates of smoking. And then her conclusion interprets that as causal. She thinks that the limitations on smoking ads cause the lower rate of smoking. We need to be skeptical by thinking of alternate explanations, and so we would think to ourselves, well, could it be reverse causality? Could it be that quitting smoking led them to ban ads? Or that there's some third factor, like a really strict government that is banning ads and forbidding smoking? The second argument is an anti-causal conclusion. So if we're fighting it, we're going to be arguing causality, that putting more people in prison can help to reduce crime. The author's going to say, what do you mean? Over the past 20 years, we've put more people in prison and the crime rate hasn't gone down. We want to get in the rhythm of thinking, even though your evidence is true, even though the crime rate hasn't gone down, I can still argue that putting people in prison can help to reduce crime. And now I got to come up with some sort of argument there. Maybe it prevented them from committing future crimes. Or maybe there's data that shows that places with lenient prison sentencing had crime rates go up. Or we could just go back to our anti-causal objection. Hey man, it could have been worse. If we hadn't done all that prison stuff, then the crime rate would actually have gone up. So the fact that it stayed the same shows it's working. Both of these arguments started with research, survey, data, and then made a conclusion that related to causal interpretations of that data. The bottom two arguments, as we said before, end with conclusions. Let's think about what type of claim the author's concluding. In the first case, it's saying the ad campaign is ill-conceived. So that sounds like a judgment or a label. We're saying, ill-conceived. Well, why? What's the evidence? Well, the sales figures are down and the new products are selling poorly. Okay, what does that have to do with the ad campaign? The author must be thinking that the ad campaign is to blame for these poor numbers. So it actually is a causal conclusion because she's making this assumption along the way. We would want to think of alternate explanations. Maybe sales are down for some other reason, like a pandemic. Maybe the new products just suck. Nobody wants them. The second conclusion is making a recommendation and sort of promising us that things will be better if we follow it. The evidence is a comparison between buildings and movies. Buildings are like movies in the sense that they're both teamwork type achievements. And since movies compete for Best Picture, buildings should compete for Best Building. Arguments by analogy often work this way. Two things have this one similarity, so they should have this other similarity too, right? Like if Kate and Paul both love going to coffee shops, then if Paul loves Phil's, shouldn't Kate also love Phil's coffee? Maybe, maybe not. Let's practice being skeptical. Again, we'll think to ourselves, even though the evidence is true, even though they both love coffee shops and Paul loves Phil's, I can still argue that Kate won't like Phil's. What could I say? I don't know, something negative. Maybe it's too expensive. Maybe it doesn't serve espresso and that's what she likes. Maybe it doesn't have as good people watching and that's why she goes to coffee shops. But my form of objection is basically going to be to point out a difference. No, there's something about Phil's that isn't like the coffee shops that Kate likes going to, so it's not fair to compare those. There are a lot of arguments that are assuming similarities. Analogies we've discussed, part versus whole is a famous flaw that assumes whatever trait belongs to the part would apply to the whole or vice versa. Another famous flaw is sampling, where you assume that whatever's true of the sample population would be true of a wider population. Then there are arguments where you're making a prediction and you're usually assuming that some current trend you're looking at will continue into the future. Our objections to the argument will basically be pointing out ways in which two things are different because we're trying to break the analogy the author is relying on. The other type of comparative argument is like, X has a positive quality, so you should do it, or X has an advantage over Y, so it's better. It's a net gain idea that you'd be better off doing X than not doing it. You'd be better off with X than with Y overall. That means that we need to analyze all the pros and cons. To judge this case, we got to know, do the negatives offset the positives? The argument we just read actually involved both. It involved an analogy between buildings and movies, or architects and movies. So we could fight the argument by saying, that's not a good comparison. Architects are more like actors, and they compete for best actor, so best architect seems to make sense. But this is also a recommendation, so are we really better off in the world where we follow this plan? Well, architects might be worse off. Maybe they rely on these individual awards or nominations to build up their brand and clientele. Any negative consequence can weaken that argument. Oh boy. Owen, you doing okay, bud?
It's turkey and mashed potatoes again.
I know, sweetie. This is a lot to process. We don't expect you to retain it all. You're almost done. Do you want some screen time when we're done? Yeah? Buddy wants some screen time? You want to play that new game where you live at the beach with your best friend horse and people serve you farm fresh eggs? All right, just 10 more minutes of learning and then you can play it for 2 hours. All right, let's pause the video one more time and dissect these 4 arguments. Well, they all had something crazy in common.
They're upside down
Arguments. What does that mean? A regular argument has evidence that builds to a conclusion. A lot of times we'll see since, because, these ideas, therefore concluding idea, which is literally the conclusion. In an upside down argument, you hear the conclusion first. You'll hear an opinion. You'll be like, wait, why should I believe that? And then when you feel the argument trying to convince you, you'll realize, okay, that was the conclusion. These often start with an attribution, an opposing claim, followed by a pivot. and have a rebuttal conclusion like, they're wrong, here's why. So upside down arguments. The first sentence here is giving us an attribution. This movie's been criticized for not being realistic. Do we get an opinion from the author in rebuttal? They're wrong, here's why. She's saying, don't hate on it for being unrealistic. Why not? Why shouldn't I be mad that it's unrealistic? Are you saying it was realistic or that it's unrealistic, but that's fine? The author then provides two ideas connected by and. That almost always means two premises. The support is, the movie was funny, and funny is how you judge comedy. So, yeah, maybe it was unrealistic, but that's fine. What did we get before the premises, though? We got a concession, which is an opposing claim that's volunteered by the author, and then usually followed by a pivot. After the first sentence, the author made some concessions. Now, it's certainly true that you're right here, and that could be problematic. She's agreeing in part with the critics. And then she uses a pivot to say, but here's my rebuttal. In this case, y'all are wrong, because this is a funny comedy, and that's all we should care about. Our second upside-down argument also started with an attribution. Party Y had accused X of illegal campaign contributions. Do we get a pivot into an opinion? We do. We hear the author saying, yeah, I disagree, though. I disagree with these accusations. They're ill-founded. How come, author? The premise is a past tense fact that is saying, well, because Party Y did something similar 3 years ago. This is a flawed way of reasoning. You can't discredit someone's argument by saying they're being a hypocrite. In the third argument, we started right away with an opinion from the author, no attribution. These plays aren't successful. It's not quite a rebuttal, but a negative judgment. All right, author, why should I believe they're not successful? He gives us a rule that says if the audience doesn't care what happens to your characters, then it's not successful. So in Bertolt's plays, does the audience not care what happens to the characters? The evidence comes close. It says, well, they can't discern any of the characters' personalities. In this argument, we start with an attribution. The mayor's saying, I think the city should accept these free streetlights. Is that an imposing claim? Are we going to get a pivot? No, we get an opinion indicator of agreement. Yep, agreed. No problem in accepting them, despite some people's fear. So there is an opposing claim embedded in the second sentence. Some people are afraid the company's trying to bribe the city into a contract, but the author is of the opinion, no, there's no problem. The city can accept him. Why? The next claim is kind of a weird mix. It's saying, well, the only reason they would want you to accept them is so that you'll show them off to other mayors. But the real premise is the final idea that the way the city awards contracts is through competitive bidding, so there's no way to bribe your way into that. Once again, we're seeing a lot of distance between the conclusion and the eventual premise. All right, so upside down arguments start with an opinion. They say something's misguided, something is not successful, it's ill-founded, or there's no problem in accepting this. A lot of the time there is some attribution or opponent to rebut this criticism, these accusations, these people's fear. And then sometimes the premise comes right after, here's why. But other times we'll get some concessions first before we eventually pivot back to the actual premise. Upside-down arguments can occur anywhere, but they're famous for showing up on main conclusion and role. You'll see a lot of first-sentence conclusions and a lot of rebuttal conclusions. All right, everybody, let's do a madcap review of everything. Arguments are a conclusion supported by at least one claim, which we can call a premise, evidence, support. A conclusion usually sounds like an opinion. It is a verdict, which means to speak the truth. The author is trying to prove that this is a true claim. There are keywords that often are present to show us the conclusion, so we want to try to memorize these, especially the top 4. Similarly, there are keywords that show us, hey, you're looking at evidence. We can memorize the acronym FABS, which reminds us for, after all, because, since always point to premises. For and after all always come after a conclusion, so the previous claim had to be a conclusion. Since and because just mean that the other half of the sentence is a conclusion. But remember, it gets a little murky. Because and since normally mean premise, so thus, hence, therefore normally mean conclusion, such as in these little mini arguments. But remember, because and since can also be used to show a cause, and these conclusion words can also be used to show an effect, like in these 2 sentences. So we do have to sometimes ask whether we're looking at reasoning or causality when we see these words. When we have multiple pieces of evidence, they may test us on whether those are just independent premises that each provide partial direct support, or whether there's sort of a hierarchical structure with more than one conclusion along the way. A lot of times the paragraph contains extraneous ingredients like attributions or background. A pivot like but yet however tells you to kind of ignore that stuff and to focus on what comes next. It might go conclusion then premise, it might go premise then conclusion. Overall, most arguments have evidence leading to a conclusion. So you sort of introduce these considerations, and then that final claim, the literal conclusion of the paragraph, is the conclusion. But we will read a lot of upside-down arguments where we get the conclusion and then it's followed by evidence. We want to get better at hearing an opinion and then asking, why should I believe that? And then noticing, okay, the author's trying to convince me of that opinion. A lot of rebuttal arguments are upside down. They start with an opposing claim and then they pivot into they're wrong, here's why. This is super common on role and main conclusion questions. When we're breaking down arguments, we can be assisted a lot by understanding the role that different keywords play. So try to memorize what's on this screen. It'll save time and brain power. Once we've identified the conclusion, we want to be super clear about what it is we're arguing about. Does she or doesn't she want to go to Yale? Once we've read the evidence, we want to be charitable to the author and think, how was she trying to make her case? That actually helps us better understand what the argument really is trying to say. And then in most cases, we'll be skeptical. We'll assign ourselves the position of the other lawyer. I'm going to argue Brianna doesn't want to go to Yale, so how will I respond to this evidence? Well, you're assuming that because the graduates make the most money, that makes Yale the best. You're overlooking the fact that Yale graduates also have the most debt in their first year of work. Or you're failing to consider that the reason they make the most money isn't because Yale prepared them, it's just because they belong to rich families who give them great jobs. The debating game that we're trying to play is that even though your evidence is true, I can argue your conclusion is wrong. So we'll be asking ourselves with arguments, how can I accept this evidence but still argue the conclusion's wrong? And with plans, we'll be saying, how could I go along with this plan but say we won't achieve the goal or won't be better off? If the author's saying we should do something, we'll try to argue, no, it would be a net negative. If they're saying, if you want Y, do X, we'll say, X doesn't help me get Y. And if they say, if you want Y, you must do X, we'll say, aren't there other ways to get Y? We talked about being skeptical with anti-causal arguments, like, I took this prep course and I only scored a 150, so that course did nothing. How do you know you wouldn't have done worse without the course? If they're using a comparison and saying, like, the self-studier got the same score as the person who took the course, so the course did nothing, we'll say, yeah, but they're not fair to compare. Like, Bob started from a way lower score and took way less time. When we see correlations, people who have quality X are more likely to have quality Y, authors will usually conclude that X causes Y. And we need to immediately think about alternate explanations. Reverse causality is the possibility that Y led to X. And then another possibility is that X and Y are both just symptoms of some third factor. X and Y are correlated because they both show up as symptoms of Z. There's three main reasoning types on the test: conditional logic, comparisons, and causation. Conditional reasoning basically means that an author has made a move from one concept to another. The evidence was about certified, the conclusion was about qualified. The author is assuming this move of if uncertified, then unqualified. In other cases, they give you a rule, but they never trigger it. We were trying to prove something wasn't successful, and the trigger was audiences don't care what happens. But all we said was audiences can't discern personalities. So the author has to assume that if you can't discern a personality, then you don't care what happens. Comparative arguments are often dealing with analogies or similarities, like what's true in A would be true in B. So you fight it by saying, no, those two cases aren't fair to compare. There's some meaningful distinction. Or they compare things by saying you'd be better off doing X than not doing X, or X is better than Y. And at that point, we want to analyze the pros and cons. Do the upsides of X really outweigh the downsides? In causal arguments, the author normally presents some asymmetric comparison and then tries to explain why it is occurring. And our main gear of skepticism is to consider alternate explanations, but we'll also consider whether the author's explanation is plausible. Like, was the suspect at the scene of the crime? Do you have any more data to corroborate your story here? Whew, we did it. We may have killed Owen along the way, but I think that was worth it.
What? I'm fine.
Here are the small goals to focus on. Find the conclusion in the evidence. Use keywords, use opinion versus fact, which idea is supporting the other. Then start trying to be skeptical of the conclusion. Even though this evidence is true, how can I still argue that the conclusion isn't? And start trying to pay attention to reasoning patterns. What kind of conclusion is it? Am I fighting a recommendation, a hypothesis, a rebuttal, a prediction? All right, that'll do it. Good work, everybody. We'll see you next time.